Welcome to the Boston Structural Heart course. Today we will be presenting a case of a difficult transseptal puncture. I'm sure you've all been to those conferences and presentations where people present impeccable images that you are only once in a while lucky to acquire them. This is a usual run-of-the-mill case with the difficult transseptal imaging and difficult transseptal crossing. We've decided to present this case to address the problems that you face in a daily life. As opposed to presentation quality images, these are usual images that you come across every day. So enjoy this case and please leave us feedback and stay tuned for the online launch of the Boston Structural Heart course. Enjoy. So, welcome to our Trans-Septal Puncture Guide podcast. This is Feroz Mahmood. I'm the Director of Cardiac Anesthesia at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and I have with me Dr. Aidan Sharkey, who is one of our attending anesthesiologists at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and part of our structural heart disease team. So we are going to discuss a patient who was referred to us for chronic functional mitral regurgitation. He was 91 years old, already had a CABG in the past, and was considered prohibitive risk for his worsening symptoms of heart failure secondary to this functional mitral regurgitation, and therefore was referred for edge-to-edge mitral valve repair because of his prohibitive risk for reoperative surgery. As you can see here, he has a slightly retracted posterior leaflet and a posteriorly directed jet, which doesn't look as bad in multiple other views, but the mid-esophageal long axis window demonstrates that this patient has co-anda effect, and we are significantly underestimating the regurgitation. Well, that was not the point in this case. And let's get to the next window where we have the mid-esophageal bicaval view of his right atrium and the left atrium. Anything you'd notice, Aidan?
Yeah, so this is a very important view for us for this procedure. And the first things you want to look at in this image here is, first of all, we're seeing a lot of wires in the bicaval view here. So I'm not sure, did this patient have ICD in or pacing wires, or what was it that he had in from before for us?
So yes, I forgot to mention this thing, that this patient had an ICD and pacemaker placed a few years ago because of his slow depressed ejection fraction and arrhythmia risk. So this was a confounding thing in the right atrium. That is the presence of an AICD cable, pacing leads, and therefore there was a lot of traffic in this small real estate.
And it's always going to be, it just makes the procedure that bit more difficult when you have all these extra leads in the right atrium, trying to decipher which is your transseptal needle, your sheath, and which is your pacing leads or ICD leads.
And holding that thought, we went on to the next important view for the decision of the site and the location of transseptal puncture, and that's the mid-esophageal short axis view, where you see the anterior and posterior margins of the septum. As you can see, that besides the fact that he has pre-existing shadows of these leads, his fossa ovalis seems to be stretched out a little bit, and there's a pre-existing indentation in there, which I'm not so sure where it came from, but I thought that it was possibly related to chronic damage by these pacing leads in this patient. So this seemed like a pretty straightforward case, but things are just getting a little complicated because of the presence of the leads and the anatomy of the fossa ovalis. But anyway, we went ahead and took a look at his mitral regurgitation. And as you can see, that this is a central mitral regurgitation, which is directed posteriorly, a very broad jet. Anything you want to know about this thing, Aidan?
Yeah, so this is, this jet is very much in keeping with ischemic mitral regurgitation. As you said, it's a very broad-based jet. The other thing that kind of comes to light viewing this here is I'm looking at the A3 kind of scallop area. And is that a perforation, or what is that we're looking at for us?
That is actually, you were spot on in this case, and this is something that bothered me the most also. It seemed like that this is not the only source of regurgitation as the coaptation defect between anterior and posterior leaflet, and what seemed like was a perforation. Now, the important thing is in three-dimensional imaging, sometimes dropout artifacts can mimic as perforations, and particularly when you incorporate color flow Doppler information, the underlying color flow can mimic as a perforation. So this was quite an integral information that we just were confounded with, and we had to square this out to figure out whether this was an actual perforation or just a dropout. So the first thing we did was I got a narrow sector 3D high frame rate examination of the mitral valve and kind of concentrated on the A3 scallop, as you pointed out. At least I don't think I could exclude the presence of a perforation. Do you agree with me?
I mean, based on these images, it certainly looks like a perforation, but I think I would want to collaborate even more so with further imaging and maybe incorporate 2D imaging as well.
Exactly. So while we tried to do a high frame rate examination of the mitral valve, but just couldn't fill in the gap and decide for certain whether this was a perforation or something else. So as you can see, we confirmed this thing in multiple views, but it didn't seem like just an imaging artifact. It seemed like a real presence. So our next thing was, just as you pointed out, to put the mitral valve in the anatomical position and at least locate where this perforation or the pseudo perforation, whatever it is can be found. And I agree with you 100%. It looked like the A3 base scallop region.
Yeah. That
the perforation or a dropout artifact was most obvious. You agree with that?
Yeah. You can see it clearly there.
Okay.
So Feroz, you are in this conundrum where you're determining, is this a perforation or is this an artifact? What's your next step with trying to decipher between the two of them?
Since this is a very significant information that we need to provide our interventionists, there are multiple things you can do, and we should start with the regular two-dimensional echocardiography, not forget about it, because remember, it's a 3D artifact. Sometimes you need 2D to figure out a 3D artifact. So what I did was a monoplane examination of the mitral valve, in which we've reported and published it in the past, where the probe is kept in the esophagus and gradually moved from the enterolateral to the posteromedial commissure of the mitral valve, isolating each scallop and isolating the zone of coaptation between the various scallops from the enterolateral to the posteromedial commissure. Using that, as you can see, we moved the probe from the A1, P1 to the A3, P3 region, trying to isolate the jet and try to see if we could find something rising out of the base of the anterior leaflet as we saw in 3D. And is that it's very obvious in this situation that there is only one regurgitation jet and there's nothing coming out of the base of the anterior leaflet. But that's not the whole story. If it's something which is outside the zone of the imaging plane or something, and if you're moving too fast, it is possible to miss it, and that's why perforations are sometimes missed. So that was my first thing to solve this. Okay,
so we've determined on 2D anyway that this is more than likely a dropout. Now, going back to our 3D image, is there anything we can do in terms of Knobology to alter our settings to try and determine even further if this is a true dropout we're seeing or perforation?
So that's a great point. So as you can see, I've highlighted the 3D and 2D settings of the machine, which I have changed from the initial image acquisition. First of all, this is a narrow sector, so obviously it's a higher line density and has a higher frame rate than a wider angle image. Secondly, as you can see, I have significantly increased the 2D and the 3D gain to see whether that artifact is covered up, and you do not see a perforation as well as we should have. A wide perforation generally should be visible even under these circumstances also. So this is the second tier of my Knobology or my image adjustments, which I did to sort out whether this was a perforation or a dropout artifact. And once we increase the gain, you can see in this 6-beat acquisition, which was done with R-wave gated, we do not see do not clearly see that perforation, and it's a clearly one jet, central, broad based, which hugs the posterior wall and seems to be curling around the left atrium with the coenda effect. So that was what we concluded.
Okay, Feroz, so moving on to our transseptal puncture, we've already decided that it's going to be a difficult procedure to optimize. What sort of protocol do you use to kind of guide the transseptal puncture in order to ensure an optimal crossing?
Well, Aaron, you're part of that manuscript that's called the Pitlock Protocol, which is based on deconstructing this complex procedure into its component parts, because and we have an incremental, we expect an incremental involvement by our fellows into this protocol that consists of practice initially, then identification of the needle, tracking it, locating the indentation, optimizing the site of indentation, and finally crossing it.
And Feroz, this is a very good protocol, and even before the pre-planning stage, we should be obviously consulting with the interventionalists and determining where do they want the site. Do they want it posteriorly, inferiorly? Where exactly is it that they want it? So there's an element of pre-planning as well.
Exactly. So while it seems generic, but it has to be modified to the patient-specific conditions that are present at that time. So if you ask me in one question, one line answer, and that would be that we follow the Pitlock Protocol in doing this thing.
And so, Feroz, just for those who haven't read the paper, can you kind of run through the elements of the Pitlock Protocol?
Yes, absolutely. So this is based on deconstructing a complex procedure into its component parts. The first step of this Pitlock Protocol is to practice, because these are the images that is the midesophageal, bicaval window, short axis view, four-chamber view that you are expected to acquire very quickly during the process of septal crossing. And while we've been taught in textbooks about the specific angle orientations and probe manipulations that you get, but patient-specific anatomy sometimes results in these images coming off the non-standardized, probe position and angle rotations. So in the practice phase, when things are not really, moving fast and they're getting ready to get access and everything, we do what is called the practice phase, where we go back and forth and acquiring these images in very quickly so that there's limited transitions between one image and the other. So that's the practice phase.
And Feroz, to me, this is probably one of the most important kind of stages of the Pitlock Protocol, because as you alluded to before, our traditional thinking is to obtain the bicaval view at an omniplane angle of 90, whereas you can see quite clearly in this patient's specific anatomy, we get the best view at 120. And so knowing this, not figuring it out mid-procedure is vital to having a kind of a smooth procedure.
And also this to be synchronous with them, because it's important, because they depend very heavily on the way we provide images, and therefore a synchronous image with their motion with their needle is extremely important. So practice being the phase before they start. And the next phase we refer to as is identification phase, or identify the needle. This becomes even more important when we have a lot of traffic issues in the right atrium. There's small real estate, imaging artifacts where it's difficult to identify the needle coming in from the specific transseptal puncture needle. The one trick that we use is to establish the continuity of the needle coming from the IVC into the right atrium towards the SVC. So that continuity from the IVC into the right atrium establishes and diagnoses conclusively as the transseptal puncture needle, and not any one of the pacing leads in this case. And as you can see, once we establish the identify the needle, we try to be very precise regarding its position and the point of its indentation. As you can see in this one, it is beginning to indent the thick portion of the superior limbus of the fossa ovalis. So practice being the first phase, identifying the needle being the second phase, and the third one, which is actually the most important one, is tracking the needle. This is where most experience is required. This is where most knowledge of the motion of the needle in the right atrium is required, and you need to make continuous synchronous imaging of the motion of the needle from the superior limbus onto the fossa ovalis. This is one of the most complicated parts that requires the most practice as we do that.
And for us, this is, as you said, quite a difficult part of the procedure. What tricks do you have for delineating between, the needle tip versus the shaft? How can we determine, which is which?
So that's a great point, because the plane of the section of the ultrasound plane can cut the needle at any cross section, which can erroneously appear to be the tip of the needle, which is not the case, and the tip may be extending beyond what we think is the tip, and we can inadvertently puncture the septum at a location which is not ideal or unsafe for that matter. So while we do not see in this one, you can see in this image is the reverberation artifact of the tip of the needle, and a lack of image beyond that is something which I have used in the past. And as you can see in this image, which is not of this patient specifically, but you can see the reverberation artifact of the tip of the needle that tracks and moves with the motion of the needle, is something that I have often used, and I'm sure with your experience you must have developed some other trick besides this also to find it. But the most important is to identify the continuity and to be absolutely certain that this is the tip of the needle.
Yeah, very good.
All right. So having done that in the mid-esophageal phase, when the needle drops into fossa ovalis, next comes the location. To see that where the needle has landed on the fossa ovalis is an incredibly important part of the procedure, and this has to be verified not only in the mid-esophageal bicaval window, which demonstrate the superior and inferior rims, but also in the short axis view also to demonstrate the maximal indentation, because that's you see it in two views where the needle is headed.
Yeah, and this is where the first stage of the procedure comes in to play, where you've practiced these images before, and you can very quickly go between your bicaval to your short axis to your four-chamber view. Now, Feroz, I have a question. What about using orthogonal plane imaging in this part of the procedure? What's your view on that?
Well, I am myself a very strong proponent of using simultaneous orthogonal plane imaging. But for some reason, I don't understand why some of our machines, because the angles of the images are different, which is a different discussion how the presets of the machine are set up. But the lateral plane sometimes being in a flip position, it's not an anatomically or echocardiographically the image that you would expect them to see. For example, simultaneous orthogonal plane of this bicaval window would end up showing the aortic valve on the left side of the screen in the lateral image, which can sometimes be a little disorienting for people who are doing this thing, and since everything is dependent upon the echocardiographic orientation, so unless you can rapidly correct it to put everything into the correct anatomical orientation and know exactly where the indentation is and how it is I'm not terribly inclined to ignore it. Yeah. But sometimes you don't get. For example, in this patient, during the practice phase, we figured out that the simultaneous orthogonal plane imaging was not very good and wouldn't demonstrate this thing. So therefore, we did not get to this thing. So this comes into the practice phase, showing that if you can get it in the practice phase of simultaneous orthogonal plane imaging, it's good. But if you don't, then don't waste time doing this thing.
And as well, it's very much dependent on how your proceduralist likes to view the images. I know our proceduralist often likes, single images, and will just ask for, a bicaval or short axis or four-chamber view, and he does not like looking at, simultaneous or orthogonal plane imaging.
And I think personally, because it requires a little mental training and spatial orientation to appreciate the translation and the lateral motion of the scan plane to see where we are in this, because there's no visual feedback on the 3D image of what we are doing,
Yeah.
Because it's purely based on just these two simultaneous 2D imaging. And while these things, when you look at it in simulators, look very good, but when doing an actual 3D, the translation and the lateral motion, there's no visual feedback to augment your understanding. So therefore, people sometimes get kind of disoriented. Okay. So anyway, moving on, once we've located the image, next we go on to optimize the image, optimize the location. Like in this patient, you can see that this was the needle in the leftmost image is a little bit more anterior than we would like it to be. That the needle has gradually shifted in real time, under real time guidance, from the anterior to the posterior margin of the fossa ovalis. While we had done this thing in the anteroposterior location, in the optimization goes that we go back to the bicaval window again and confirm that we have not changed our location in the bicaval window, and see that the transseptal puncture in the supra-inferior margin is still exactly in the location. And if you see in the lower right corner, you see that mid-esophageal four-chamber view, which we are using to identify what is erroneously misnamed as the height of the septal puncture above the mitral annulus, which again is a different discussion, but ideally people like it to be within about 4 centimeters. So in this case, you can see that it is about a little over 4 centimeters. So that consists of optimization of the image. But you need to go back and forth sometimes at this location, because this is your last chance to be certain of where you are headed with this transseptal puncture.
Yeah, and again, just to go back again, this is where the practice component comes into play, a lot, because you need to go back to each of these 3 images, very quickly, and make sure you're optimized in all 3 views, because you cannot stay tented like this for too long.
Yes, because the needle will, with the respiratory motion and the translation motion of the heart, you can easily capture. And now this is the last stage, which is done in real time, and that's when the needle crosses. We wanted for this specific case the puncture to be rather posterior and rather inferior. When we go over the case, we'll go over why we did this thing, but this was a pre-planned and not an erroneous puncture of this needle. So this thing again to demonstrate that it is important to have a complete huddle before you go on to do a transseptal puncture, to do what you're going to exactly do, what are the challenges, and how we're going to resolve those challenges to do a transseptal puncture.
Great.
Thank you. Great. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the launch of the Boston Structural Heart Disease course in 2022. Thanks.